They say prison takes everything from you, first the noise, the schedule, the mirrors you used to hide behind. But for Diddy, the first thing it took was control. And now something strange is happening behind those walls because words that were never supposed to leave the building are suddenly everywhere. Screenshots, audio claims, secondhand quotes, people repeating the same line like it's a warning, like it's a confession, like it's a message. So here's the question. Do you think Diddy's words from inside jail are a real warning or a distraction meant to protect someone else? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you want the full breakdown as this story gets darker, hit subscribe because the next details are where everything flips. Now let's be careful with what's real and what's rumored because the internet is moving fast. But here's what's not up for debate. When a high-profile inmate loses privacy, that changes the entire game. In jail, information is currency, attention is oxygen, and your name, your face, your past becomes a target before you ever step into a yard. One of the most repeated claims circling right now is that Diddy isn't just in custody, he's being watched differently, moved differently, handled like someone the system doesn't want harmed, not out of kindness, but because a headline inside a facility becomes a wildfire outside the facility. And that's where the first tension comes in, because there are two versions of protection in a place like that. Protection can mean safety, or protection can mean isolation. And isolation is where people start breaking, especially people who built their entire identity on being surrounded. Think about what Diddy's public life was for decades. Rooms filled with people, cameras, music, movement, noise, influence, favors, smiles that weren't always real but still worked. In jail, none of that matters. You don't walk into a room and the room changes. The room already decided what you are before you arrive. And when the world starts saying his words from inside jail went viral, you have to ask something even sharper. Who benefits from those words spreading? Because if this was truly private, it wouldn't be public. And if it's public, somebody opened the door. That's why this story doesn't feel like a simple update. It feels like a leak, a pressure test, a message being passed through the audience like a courier. And once you see it that way, the pieces start lining up differently. There's been a consistent pattern across high-profile cases. The public thinks the courtroom is the main event, but the real battle often happens in the shadows through narratives, through selective clips, through what gets repeated and what gets buried. And the moment a celebrity is inside, the narrative gets even more valuable because the person at the center can't easily respond, can't post freely, can't do the same kind of damage control. So what happens? Other voices rush in to fill the silence. Some act like defenders. Some act like enemies. Some act like they're just asking questions. But the result is always the same. The public starts building a story out of fragments. And fragments are dangerous because you can shape them into anything. That's why Diddy's own words is such a powerful phrase. It's a shortcut to credibility. If it's his words, it feels proven. If it's his words, it feels final. But if those words are being filtered through other people, then the words aren't the story. The filter is. So let's talk about what keeps showing up in these conversations. Fear. Not fear like he's nervous. Fear like someone in there wants a moment. Because in a facility, attacking a famous inmate isn't just violence. People treat it like a ticket, a way to become a name, a way to send a signal to someone outside. And when the internet repeats claims about threats, attempted confrontations, or he's a target, it creates a pressure cooker on both sides. It pressures the facility. It pressures the legal team. It pressures the people connected to the case. And it pressures the public to pick a side without even knowing what they're holding. Then there's the second layer, the psychological one, the part most people don't talk about. When someone spends years believing they can steer outcomes with influence, jail is not just punishment, it's humiliation. Because the rules are not negotiable. Your schedule is not yours. Your phone time is not yours. Your privacy is not yours. And even your name doesn't protect you the way it did outside. That's why the viral words angle hits so hard. Because if those words exist, and if they're real, then you're watching a powerful man try to do the only thing he still can, control the story with language. Even from a place where he can't control anything else. And once that idea lands, The next question becomes unavoidable. Are these words a warning because he's scared or a strategy because he's still playing chess? Now, the internet loves to turn every update into a movie scene. People want a single villain, a single hero, a single sentence that explains everything. But real scandals don't move like that. They move like fog. You don't notice it's thick until you can't see the road anymore. And in this case, the fog is made of one specific ingredient: missing context. Every time a new clip circulates, you'll notice something. It's never the full conversation. It's never the full source. It's never the full timeline. It's always a piece, and pieces are perfect for manipulation because you can zoom in until the audience forgets what's outside the frame. That's why a lot of commentary around this case, especially from loud personalities online, keeps coming back to one theme. They're making it about one man, not because one man can't be responsible for his choices, but because when a scandal gets reduced to a single face, everyone else gets to step back into the shadows. And shadows are comfortable. Shadows are where careers survive. Shadows are where alliances hide. So if Diddy's words are going viral, ask yourself what else is going quiet at the same time. What story got paused so this story could take the stage? What name stopped trending the moment his name started trending again? What connection didn't make the headline because the headline needed one face? And here's the part that makes this feel darker. The more isolated a person becomes in public, the more exposed they become in private. Because if everyone believes you're alone, then nobody thinks twice when you're treated like you're alone. This is how pressure builds inside facilities. This is how rumors become threats. This is how a narrative online can become behavior offline. And if you think that can't happen, ask yourself why so many high-profile cases suddenly turn into a chain of incidents once the public attention peaks. It's not always coincidence. Sometimes it's opportunity, sometimes it's timing, sometimes it's a message. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility in this entire story. What if the viral words aren't meant for you? What if they're meant for someone watching quietly, someone who understands exactly what those words imply, someone who knows the parts the public will never see? Because in scandals like this, the loudest audience isn't always the crowd. Sometimes it's the insiders, and the crowd is just the amplifier. Now, I'm going to tell you something you need to keep in mind as this goes forward. If Diddy's alleged words are spreading and the narrative is getting sharper, there are only a few ways that happens. Either someone around him wants to help, someone around him wants to hurt, or someone around him wants to control what the public believes before something bigger drops. And that last one is the reason you should pay attention to what's missing, not just what's being said. Because the next phase of this story isn't about what Diddy said. It's about what those words are trying to cover. And once you see the pattern, you start noticing something else: a timeline inconsistency, a leak that shows up too perfectly, a clip that spreads too quickly, a phrase that sounds like it was written for headlines, not whispered for survival. And when you connect those dots, you realize the scariest part isn't what's happening inside. It's what might be happening outside while everyone stares at the cell. Because the moment the public believes the story ends in jail, that's when the real story gets to move unnoticed. And there's one specific detail, one that's been floating under the surface, that makes this entire viral words moment feel less like an accident and more like a signal. And once you hear what that detail is, you'll understand why people are suddenly asking the same question in private. Who opened the door and why now? Because once a story like this reaches a certain volume, silence becomes suspicious. That's the part most people miss. When someone's name is everywhere, but their actual voice isn't, the gap fills itself. Analysts step in, commentators step in, sources close to the situation step in, and before long, the public thinks it's hearing the truth, when really it's hearing interpretations stacked on top of each other like unstable bricks. That's exactly what's happening here. You'll notice that none of the so-called viral words are being presented cleanly. There's no full recording laid out start to finish. No uncut transcript with context before and after. Just fragments, phrases lifted, reshaped, and repeated until they start to sound official. That's not an accident, because in moments like this, clarity would actually slow things down. Confusion keeps attention locked. Confusion makes people argue. Confusion turns viewers into unpaid distributors, sharing clips, reacting, reposting, filling in blanks with their own assumptions. And assumptions are powerful. They turn possibility into belief. Now look at the timing. These words don't surface randomly. They surface after the verdict, after the sentence, after the public has already decided who the villain is. That's important because once the audience feels settled, they stop asking big questions. So if something needs to be buried, this is when you bury it. By flooding the feed with one controlled angle. This is where the jail environment becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a tool. Inside, everything is monitored. Calls, visits, movements. Which means anything that escapes those walls does so with friction. It passes through hands, through systems, through people who decide what gets out and how. So when a narrative starts spreading that sounds strangely polished, almost designed to be quoted, you have to ask, was this leaked or was it released? There's a difference. A leak exposes, a release frames, and framing is the real power here. Notice how the conversation keeps circling the same themes: danger, fear, isolation, pressure. Those ideas do something specific to the audience. They humanize without absolving. They create sympathy without innocence. They keep the subject central without reopening the case itself. That's a very careful balance. Too much fear, and people ask why. Too little, and people move on. But just enough? That keeps the spotlight warm without burning. And while the spotlight stays fixed on one cell, other rooms go dark. That's the part insiders understand. Because cases like this are never just about one person. They're about networks, relationships, decisions that didn't happen in isolation. But the public doesn't like networks, it likes faces. So if the story becomes a powerful man alone behind bars, then the system feels clean. The narrative feels complete. Problem solved. Except it's not. Because there's another layer here that rarely gets discussed: reputation management after incarceration. Most people assume jail is the end of the story, but for celebrities, it's often the beginning of a different one. A story where legacy becomes the last battlefield, and words matter more than ever. That's why phrases attributed to Diddy are being dissected like scripture. Every line is treated like a clue. Every tone analyzed for weakness or defiance. Is he remorseful? Is he angry? Is he calculating? Is he broken? But the truth is, you can't accurately answer any of that from fragments. And that uncertainty is being used, because uncertainty keeps the audience engaged longer than certainty ever could. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. When people talk about protection inside, they rarely explain what that really looks like. It's not a shield. It's not comfort. It's restriction, limited contact, limited movement, limited exposure, which means fewer witnesses, fewer unpredictable variables, and fewer chances for something unscripted to happen. That kind of control isn't about safety alone, it's about liability. And when liability is at stake, messaging becomes critical. So ask yourself, if these words are real, who benefits from them sounding the way they do? Do they paint him as reckless? Do they paint him as reflective? Do they paint him as targeted? Or do they subtly reinforce the idea that everything important already happened, and now it's just consequences playing out? Because that last narrative is the most convenient one of all. It tells the audience, there's nothing left to uncover. But history says otherwise. In almost every major scandal involving power, the truth doesn't surface all at once. It leaks in stages. And each stage is shaped by who controls the conversation at that moment. Right now, the conversation is being shaped around containment. Contain the outrage. Contain the curiosity. Contain the damage. And you do that by narrowing the frame until only one story fits inside it. But frames crack, especially when timelines don't line up, especially when details surface that don't match the version people were told to accept. And there's already tension here. People are starting to notice that some of the loudest voices discussing this case weren't loud at the beginning. They arrived late, with confidence, with certainty, with explanations that feel rehearsed. That's when skepticism creeps in, because genuine reactions are messy, controlled narratives are smooth, and this one is very smooth, almost too smooth, which brings us back to the original claim, Diddy's own words. If they truly are his words, then eventually they'll need to stand on their own without filters, without commentary, without interpretation. And if they can't, then the story isn't about what he said. It's about why the world is being told he said it this way. And once that realization hits, the focus starts shifting from the cell to the people standing outside it, deciding which pieces of the truth are safe to release. Because in stories like this, the most dangerous thing isn't a man behind bars. It's the people still free who need the story to end exactly where it is. Once a narrative settles in the public's mind, it becomes hard to dislodge. People don't just consume the story, they defend it. They argue for it. They attach their own identity to what they believe happened. And that's why the next phase of this situation isn't loud, it's subtle. Because when the audience is convinced they already understand the ending, the story doesn't need noise anymore. It just needs maintenance. That's where the conversation around Diddy has quietly shifted. At first, everything was explosive arrests, headlines, reactions, speculation. But now notice the tone. It's calmer, more analytical, almost resigned. People speak as if the case is complete, as if the moral judgment has already been rendered, and all that's left is time passing. That's dangerous, because resignation is the easiest state to manipulate. When people feel tired of a topic, they stop digging. They stop questioning new details. They accept surface-level explanations because they want closure, not complexity. And closure is exactly what controlled narratives offer. This is why the idea of his words from inside jail is so effective at this stage. It creates the illusion of finality, as if the man at the center has already spoken, already explained himself, already been heard. But being heard is not the same as being understood, and being quoted is not the same as being truthful, especially when quotes travel without context. Think about how information actually moves in environments like this. Nothing comes straight from point A to point B. It passes through intermediaries, people with their own incentives, their own fears, their own loyalties. That means every step introduces distortion, not always malicious, sometimes strategic, sometimes protective, sometimes self-serving, and sometimes preemptive. Because one of the oldest strategies in crisis management is to release a version of the story before a more damaging version can surface. Once the public internalizes one narrative, alternatives sound like conspiracy, even when they're grounded in fact. So ask yourself, what would need to be preempted right now? What information would be most dangerous if it appeared without preparation? That question is where things start getting uncomfortable. Because behind every major scandal, there's a secondary story about who knew what and when they knew it. And those stories don't live comfortably in headlines. They live in timelines, emails, meetings, quiet decisions that only matter years later. When you frame everything around one individual, those secondary stories stay buried. And that's why some critics keep pointing out the same pattern. The focus is narrow by design, not to defend anyone, but to limit exposure. And that's where the jail narrative becomes useful again. Because a man behind bars feels contained, neutralized, finished. The public assumes there's no more influence there. But influence doesn't disappear just because someone is locked up. It changes form. It becomes indirect. It becomes reputational. It becomes symbolic. Words attributed to someone in custody carry weight precisely because they feel stripped of advantage. The audience assumes honesty because they assume there's nothing left to gain. That assumption is powerful and exploitable. Now let's talk about something most coverage avoids: how fame reshapes accountability. When someone famous falls, the system often rushes to demonstrate that consequences exist. That performance is necessary, it restores faith. But the performance can also stop short of the full truth, especially if that truth implicates more than one powerful figure. So the story becomes about one downfall instead of a shared ecosystem. And ecosystems are messy. They don't fit into viral clips. They don't end cleanly. They force uncomfortable conversations about complicity, silence, benefit, and trade-offs. That's why the focus keeps snapping back to Diddy himself, his mental state, his safety, his words, his image. It's a pressure valve. As long as people argue about him, they're not asking about structure. They're not asking about patterns. They're not asking why certain things happen when they did, or why certain people seem untouched. And here's the part that should make you pause. Every time a new insider detail drops, it's framed as shocking but not destabilizing. It doesn't overturn the story, it reinforces it. That's not how genuine leaks usually behave. Real leaks disrupt. They force corrections. They create panic. These details, on the other hand, feel absorbable, almost designed to fit neatly into what people already believe. That's a signal. It suggests the narrative isn't being challenged, it's being curated. And curation is not truth-seeking, it's audience management. Now, none of this means every claim circulating is false. Reality is rarely that simple. But it does mean the way information is being released deserves scrutiny, because timing matters, tone matters, and framing matters. If these words were truly raw, truly unfiltered, truly unintended for the public, they wouldn't arrive so cleanly packaged. They wouldn't sound like they're meant to be debated on social media. They'd sound messy, emotional, contradictory, human. Instead, what we're seeing feels measured, and measurement implies planning, which brings us to the deeper tension that's starting to surface quietly in the background. People are beginning to ask whether the story they're consuming is about justice or about containment, whether it's about accountability or about closure. Because those are not the same thing. Justice opens doors, containment closes them, and closure, when it comes too quickly, often means something was left unresolved. So when you hear Diddy's own words from inside jail, don't just listen to the words. Listen to what they allow you to stop asking. Listen to what conversations disappear once those words take center stage. Because the most effective narratives don't convince you of something new. They convince you there's nothing left to discover. And if that belief settles in, the story doesn't end. It just goes quiet. And quiet in cases like this is where the most important truths tend to hide. By the time a story reaches this stage, the damage is rarely loud anymore. It's subtle. It lives in what people stop asking. And right now, that's the most revealing part of everything unfolding around Diddy. Because look at what the conversation has become. It's no longer about uncovering new facts. It's about interpreting fragments, debating tone, guessing intention, arguing over meaning. That shift matters because once the public moves from investigation to interpretation, the outcome is already being emotionally processed even if the truth isn't complete. That's how narratives solidify. And once a narrative hardens, it stops evolving. The idea that his words from inside jail went viral sounds like transparency. It feels like access. It gives people the sense that they're finally hearing from the source. But access without full context isn't clarity, it's control. Because context is where accountability lives. Without it, words become symbols. And symbols can be used to calm outrage, redirect blame, or quietly close chapters that were never fully opened. Now think about this from a distance. If these words are circulating now after sentencing, after public judgment, after fatigue has set in, then they're arriving at the exact moment people are most willing to accept a simplified ending. Not a true ending. A convenient one. And convenience has always been the enemy of truth. There's also something else happening that's easy to miss if you're only watching headlines. As the focus narrows on Diddy as an individual, the system around him fades into the background. The relationships, the gatekeepers, the people who benefited stayed silent or moved on untouched. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the audience is encouraged to believe the story has a single center of gravity, one face, one voice, one downfall. But power rarely works alone. And history shows that when scandals are reduced to a single person, the larger patterns remain intact. They resurface later, with new names, new faces, same dynamics. That's why this moment matters. Not because of what Diddy may or may not have said, but because of what those words are doing to the larger conversation. They're slowing it down. They're narrowing it. They're encouraging people to look inward at one man's mindset instead of outward at the structure that enabled everything to happen in the first place. And when attention moves inward like that, pressure eases elsewhere. That's the real shift. Now consider the psychological angle one last time. A person in custody becomes a symbol very quickly. Every word attributed to them gets loaded with meaning: fear, regret, strategy, weakness, defiance. The public projects what it wants to see. But projection is not evidence, and emotion is not resolution. What's unsettling here is how comfortable the narrative feels now, how clean the edges are, how rarely anyone pauses to say, wait, what's missing? Because something always is. There are timelines that haven't been fully connected, decisions that were made quietly, people who appeared briefly in the story and then vanished from it, moments that don't quite line up when you look too closely. Those gaps aren't just oversights, they're warning signs. And the longer the public accepts a simplified version of events, the harder it becomes for more complicated truths to surface without resistance. That's why this story doesn't feel finished no matter how many times it's framed that way. It feels paused, like a file that's been closed before all the pages were read. And if you've followed enough stories like this, you know what usually happens next. Either new information forces the narrative to crack open again, or everything stays buried until enough time passes that accountability no longer feels urgent. Both outcomes depend on one thing: whether people keep asking the right questions, not the loud ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones that don't fit neatly into viral clips or trending topics. So when you hear about Diddy's words from inside jail, don't just ask what he said. Ask why those words surfaced now. Ask who benefits from that framing. Ask what conversations stopped the moment those words took over the timeline. Because the truth doesn't usually announce itself. It waits. And it waits for people who are willing to look past the story they're being handed and notice the parts that don't quite make sense. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think these viral words are about honesty or about control of the narrative? Are people reacting to a man or to a pattern they're uncomfortable recognizing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of where this story goes next, make sure you subscribe, because if you think this chapter raised questions, what comes after it won't be quiet at all.